Hi there. I was just looking over Lloyd E. Ambrosius's book, Wilsonian Statecraft, The Theory and Practice of Liberal Internationalism During World War I. And that sounds a bit dry, but trust me, it's actually a really good book. This was actually written by my advisor. When I was in graduate school, I had an advisor. It was Lloyd E. Ambrosius, and this book was one of his two books on Woodrow Wilson. You see, the interesting thing about Woodrow Wilson is that even today, 100 years after he's President of the United States, he's still extremely controversial in history. Historians haven't come to a consensus necessarily on Woodrow Wilson. There are two schools of thought really on his legacy. Now there's other portions of his presidency I could talk about, but really what this comes down to is his legacy. Now, as many of you may know, at the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson was president and had this big grand plan, the 14 points, which include the League of Nations. This was it. It was the last time the world was going to go to this sort of extreme war. No longer would the whole world be embroiled in this horrible, bloody conflict if Woodrow Wilson had his way. He was going to give them the League of Nations and sort of international peace, and the United States would now sort of separate it from that old guard of Europe and make the world a better place, but for democracy and well, liberalism. And pretty much throughout the 50s and 60s, historians actually kind of did agree on this. Now, I have another book here. I have The American President, which talks about all the presidents, but specifically when they get to Woodrow Wilson, they make this earlier point, that Wilson was a man ahead of his time, that he was a forward thinker. Because think about it, after World War II we get the United Nations and a much larger push for peace, with the United States really heading up a new international organization more dedicated to keeping us out of those larger type of conflicts. And so what a lot of historians gave Wilson credit for was seeing what the world needed to be, but not quite accomplishing it because of a Congress that blocked him. Henry Cabot Lodge, famously, and other Republicans stopped Wilson from passing the League of Nations. He wanted it badly, but the United States never joined because those Republicans were isolationist, and they didn't believe in the League of Nations the way Wilson did. But then again, Wilson was also part of the reason we didn't get in the League of Nations. He wouldn't compromise. He wouldn't sort of put aside his own ego. He wouldn't give in to some demands of the Republicans, which you have to do in a democracy. So Wilson, according to Ambrosius and many others who came later, wasn't faultless in the failures of the League of Nations, the fact that World War II came about. He was also responsible. He had his own struggles. He failed to sell his idea in many ways, and he clung to this very, very exact definition of what he wanted, and his clinging to that made what he wanted almost impossible to get. Now, as many people pointed out, and many who know a little about history may know, he had a stroke towards the end of his presidency, and for the last 7 months was basically incapacitated. And there are many who blame this for his firmness, but as Ambrosius points out in this book particularly, he was fairly firm before the stroke. He wanted this just as it was. So there are two schools of thought. Wilson was the forward progressive thinker ahead of everybody else in his thinking, or he was the unbending kind who, though he was ahead of his time perhaps a little bit, wasn't really willing to bend to make it work. He wanted a more impractical sort of beautiful construction. Which of these two is right? Well, I admit personally, since I was Dr. Ambrosius' student, I tend to side with his views of it. But that doesn't make him necessarily right. Here's another book, The Reader's Companion to the American Presidency. This one actually brings up the controversy and talks about it as it is. Talks about how many times historians still aren't sure how to feel about Woodrow Wilson. They're still not sure, was he really that progressive forward thinker, or was he just another politician who had a good idea, an idea that was coming, but really couldn't make it work, couldn't really had the ability as a politician, a thinker, to give it life. He just wasn't quite good enough. He was unbending and wouldn't make his liberalism work, and the world wasn't ready for it in some ways, and they didn't see it as realistic either. I do have one more book here I want to point out. This is Jim Powell's Wilson's War. Now, Jim Powell is a very well-known journalist and writer and lecturer, and he's at the Cato Institute. Very smart guy, but this book is one I strongly disagree with. This book takes Dr. Ambrosius' point and takes it to an extreme level. This essentially blames Woodrow Wilson for World War II and all the problems that took place between the two wars that led to the Second War. I mean, it takes some extreme points of view where making Wilson's decision seemed like the only thing that led to communism, Nazism, fascism, and that's a little unfair. Yeah, Wilson had his faults, and as I say, Dr. Ambrosius's points I take very well and take to heart about him having his failures and making the League of Nations sort of unrealistic in many ways. But to actually literally blame him for World War II when there's a lot of people to blame for World War II, not just Woodrow Wilson, though maybe you could sort of stick some blame on him. There's also Georges Clemenceau, the leader of France, who badly wanted him to take retribution from the Germans. There's George, the British Prime Minister, who let the French kind of have their way and want to protect the English Empire at all costs, including the cost of the League of Nations. There's a lot of blame to go around and going from World War I to World War II, but here Powell lays almost all of it squarely on Woodrow Wilson's back, which I find to be too extreme a point of view. It's sort of, I like more of the middle ground, which I think is here Dr. Ambrosius's points of view. There's a second book which I don't have, but so there you have it. See, Woodrow Wilson, here he is 100 years later, and we still haven't decided what his legacy was. Was he a forward thinker, someone who was ahead of his time by a good almost 30 years? It's when the League of Nations became the United Nations. They weren't actually the same organization, but that's what we got. Was he ahead of his time before the United Nations came? Or was he just another politician who had a decent idea, but struggled to bring it to fruition because he was a politician, he was just a man, and he maybe wasn't ahead of his time as we think he was. He was just throwing an idea out there, but not really making it work, and torpedoing it as much as anybody by not getting the United States involved. Almost everything in history has a good side and a bad side. Nothing is completely positive, nothing is completely negative. And Wilson, well, he's as split as anything. So there you have it. There are the two varying viewpoints on the legacy of Woodrow Wilson. And you know what? Do your own research and think what you will. I think I'm going to keep doing a little of my own. I hope that brings you a little historical perspective.